All right, so tonight I thought we would choose as our subject something which is what they call inyana diyoma, something which is pertinent to the current time, which is of course Hanukkah. We have another night to go, another lighting to go. We really have 2 days to go of Hanukkah. And one of the very common questions or issues that's raised in contemporary responsa regarding Hanukkah is, of course, the use of electric lights for Hanukkah. Now, this is the tip of the iceberg of a bigger question, which is, what is the view of Jewish law when it comes to electricity? And electricity obviously being a relatively modern discovery/invention. The use of it is certainly a modern phenomenon. And so classical sources don't have much to say about the issue of electricity for obvious reasons. And although they did take a biblical term of chashmal, which is from the vision of Yecheskel, from the vision of Ezekiel, to describe electricity in modern Hebrew. And apparently that's because what he seems to be observing there is lightning. So they took that to be the term for electricity, which is not a bad choice. But still, there was no real concept of electricity as something that could be harnessed or used in the ways that we use it, not even a remote concept. So there was sort of an evolution in halachic understanding or in rabbinic understanding of electricity and the challenges that it posed and the problems as well as the benefits, potential benefits of it. And what we're going to see not so much tonight, because this teshuvah, the responsa that we're going to take a look, the two responsa that we're going to look at tonight, deal with the issue of Hanukkah candles, which are relatively, it's a relatively mild application of the issue of electricity. What we're hopefully going to get to either next week or the following week is Hakham Ovadiah's more involved teshuvot, where he deals with the permissibility of using electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov, much more complicated. And he has another teshuvah where he discusses the issue of Shabbat candles, also a more involved discussion. What's fascinating in particular about his responsum, where he tackles the issue of electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov, is that he starts out using what you might call the more primitive or rudimentary view of electricity as fire, which is what the rabbis initially thought. And then at the end of the teshuvah, he says, actually, I just spoke to, my friend Rav Orbach, who spoke to scientists, and I realized it's not really fire, and therefore it's not this. And then he kind of concludes the responsum without going back and changing any of the conclusions that he made under the first premise. So it's a really interesting responsum because he changes understanding what we call the mitziut of the material facts in the middle of the teshuvah or towards the end of it, but he doesn't exactly go back and revise his understanding of the applications. It kind of to give an analogy that won't have meaning for many people here probably, but has maybe meaning for someone who's going to listen to this. There's a similar thing that happened in psychological theory, where Freud had many different evolutions of his thought, and some of his writing, which is his most famous writing, is on dreams. But when he wrote his interpretation of dreams, it was based on the earlier theoretical concept of psychoanalysis that he had towards the beginning of his career. But by the end of his career, when he had a totally different concept, he never went back and rewrote the early works. So some later psychoanalysts went and said, well, now we really have to adapt, the theory of dreams to the rest of the theory. So in the same way, Hakham Ovadiah kind of leaves us hanging in that teshuvah, as we're going to see, and kind of hints to you that a lot of what I said here is not correct. But he doesn't guide you back towards the more controversial conclusions that might emerge from the revised understanding. But that doesn't become so relevant to this teshuvah. So let's just take a look at what we have in front of us today. What we have in front of us today this is first from Yechaveh Da'at. Yechaveh Da'at was published after the teshuvah that we're going to read after it. Okay, or so it would seem. At least I think so. It says, "Ha'im yicholim latzeit yedei chovat adlakat nerot Chanukah al yedei adlakat Chanukiah hashmalit." Can somebody fulfill the mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah candles with a Chanukiah hashmalit, an electric menorah like such as the one that we have right there? Va'im al kol panim Hashem levarach b'beit hakneset adlakat Chanukiah hashmalit shemeira Yafa. What happens if you have a Chanukiah, let's say? We know that there's a mitzvah in the house to have a lighting of the menorah. There's also a mitzvah in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue. Is there maybe a difference that maybe in the Beit Knesset we could be more lenient and use the electric menorah? So he's going to deal with both of these questions. And what's interesting is that we have here a teshuvah, which I'm not exactly sure of the chronology because it's not always clear in the teshuvot. He refers to some of his teshuvot in this, but not to the one that we're going to read second. The second one that I brought here, he discusses a lot of the same topics and a lot of the same issues, but he comes at it from a different angle. Here he starts out with a generous angle. He says, "B'mesechet Shabbat amru shmanim uptilot shamru Hakamim ein madlikim behem b'Shabbat." Oils and wicks that the rabbis said you cannot use for Shabbat candles. Because there's a whole thing we know that we read on Friday night, Bameh madlikin, or Bameh ein madlikin. What are you allowed to use? What are you not allowed to use? These are the halachot of how do you light candles on Shabbat. So all of those things, because they don't light so well. Madlikim behem b'Chanukkah. Nonetheless, you can use them on Hanukkah. What's the reason? The reason is basically because the reason why you can't use certain wicks or certain oils on Shabbat is because it might go out. And on Hanukkah, we don't care if it goes out. Right? We don't care if it goes out. We don't have to relight it. Or on Shabbat, the other reason is because on Shabbat, you can benefit from the light. So we're worried if it's not shining so well, you might go and tilt it to get it better. On Hanukkah, you're not allowed to use the light. So on Hanukkah, we don't have to be concerned about the wicks or the oils. So v'chen pasak Rambam v'zeh leshon kol hashemanim v'aptilot kshirim lener Chanukah afal pi she'en hashemanim nimshachim achar hapetila ve'en ha'or nitlet yafa b'otan haptilot. So the Rambam says even though the wicks might not be the best, these oils might not be the best in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of light, it doesn't matter. They're still acceptable for Chanukah use. Now, v'chen pasku ator b'shulchan aruch. And this is what the Torah and the Shulchan, in other words, all the codes of law take this as the halacha. So if that's the case, if we have a blanket statement that anything is good is very generous. So what does it come out? Right? So why can't you use an electric menorah? If you're telling me I can use anything, as long as it, even if it doesn't light so well. He says, not only is it not inferior, it's actually superior. The light is very good. It never goes out unless the power goes out. So what's the complaint about it? So if you're telling me that even oils and wicks that are inferior in the light that they produce or are less reliable, let's say, in their production of light, if those are allowed, so certainly an electric menorah should be allowed because, let's face it, it's very stable. In fact, there's a controversial but very fascinating statement by Harav Mesas, who was a Moroccan posek that preceded Hakham Ovadiah, and he quotes him in some of his discussions here. Although he was known as very radical, and a lot of times his opinions weren't accepted because he was so radical, he has an entire book that he wrote about questions about Hanukkah. And one of the things he says there is not only does Harav Mesas say that you can use electric menorah, he says that if they had electricity in the time that the Beit HaMikdash was built, they would have used electric menorah then too. That's what he says, if they had electricity, because it's much better. He says it never goes out. It's very reliable. The light is very good. What's not to like about the electric menorah? So he says, you know what? If they had that in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, he would have used an electric menorah. There's no question. That's what Harav Mesas says. Okay, but anyway, that's not what Hakham Ovadiah says. It's just an interesting thing. But then he brings it. V'chein pasak Rav Gaon, Rabbi Yosef Mesas. This is what the Rav Gaon, Rav Yosef Mesas says, that you can use it. You can use it. Not only does he say you can use it, he says that he doesn't see a problem what the question is. Of course, it's a perfectly good light. Yes?
Sorry, just to get this off my chest, because otherwise I'll forget it, and I should have asked. But does it fulfill the mitzvah of lighting?
That's what he's asking. That's the whole question. Right, so he has another tshuva where he talks about Ner Shabbat. The light of Shabbat is actually a little bit simpler of an answer. There are more people who say you can light Nerot Shabbat with electricity than say Ner Chanukah. Why? Because Ner Shabbat, the main thing is that you have light in the house. That's the main thing. It says that because it's for Shalom Bayit. It's so that you have harmony in the home, you eat the meal with light, it's not in the dark. But Ner Hanukkah is more about the spectacle itself. It's a different concept. So, being that it's a different concept, there are different conclusions. We'll see a little bit more about that. But yeah, when he gets into the issue of electricity for Shabbat, he's also asking the same question, and he's more lenient over there. Now, he says, "V'omnam hagaon Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes." Very Ashkenazi. He's got a very good name. ושלו שבו בית יצחק כתב שאין יוצאים ידי חובת נר חנוכה לא בגז ולא בחשמל. He says you can't use gas. In other words, let's say you wanted to light a gas range as your ner Hanukkah. Not good. חשמל, electricity, nope. מפני שהדלקת שמן זית היא מצווה מן המובחר. Because really we should all be using olive oil. That's really the ideal. כמו שפסק הרמה. ועוד שמכיוון שעשויים הם להדליק לעיר בכל ימות השנה אין בהם משום פרסומי ניסה וכן מה שכתב הרמה שיסרו שלא להדליק נרות חנוכה במקום שמדליקים נרות תמיד בכל ימות השנה. So basically what he says is he gives two reasons. He says first of all the ideal would be for us all to use olive oil. Now we're already not using olive oil, so how far do you want to go away from olive oil? We should be as close as we can. So, cottonseed oil, maybe, other kinds of oil, but simply turning on a gas range or electricity, that's not like oil at all, that's no good. Secondly, the Rama writes that when we put the Nerot Chanukah, we shouldn't put them in the place where we normally... Now, we don't have this experience because we don't normally light a lamp in our house. We normally use electricity, and we only light candles when it's a mitzvah or the power goes out, right? But in those days they would have a lamp all the time. So the Rama says, the Rama is the Harav Moshe Isserles. Is the Ashkenazic posek that writes in the Shulchan Aruch. He says you should make sure to put the Chanukiah not in the place where you normally put your lamp. In other words, because it's not going to be clear that it's something special. So he says, so too here, electricity is what we use all the time. How can we use electricity for the Ner Chanukah? People won't know the difference. So those are the two reasons he gives.
Well, you can still put it in a different place.
You can put it in a different place. But he's saying since we always use electric lights, it should be special, right? We should try to make it special. So therefore he rejects this. So now Hakham Ovadiah, again, he starts this teshuvah differently than he starts his other one. This one he starts out looking like he's trying to defend the lenient position. Right? So he says, Ulam, and that's where I underlined, En dvarav mukhrachim. This is not a persuasive argument. It's not a knockdown, what do they say, drag out argument, right? Why? Because even though it's true that olive oil is the best, so what that olive oil is the best? Really, any kind of fuel is allowed. So if any kind of fuel is allowed, who's to say that gas is not allowed? Who's to say that electricity is not allowed? If it says any fuel, we're already not doing the quote-unquote ideal of olive oil. So what sense does it make to draw the line? You're going to draw your imaginary line wherever you want? Wherever you all of a sudden decided, that's too different. Who says it's too different? That's arbitrary. So he says that's number one. Okay, what's number one? In other words, true, you're not doing the ideal, but you're still doing something. And the second reason that, we use electricity all the time. It's not different. He says that's not a good reason. Because back in the olden days, everybody used olive oil every single day for lighting candles, and then they also used it for Ner Hanukkah. Even when they lit their Chanukiot inside the house, which until the Jews made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, everybody was doing it inside the house. Nobody did it outside. Now they're bringing back the outside, but they didn't do that in the olden days. And all we required was that you place them in a different spot in the house than what you normally place them. Okay? So back then everybody used olive oil all year round, and the way that you showed that it was a nerot, that it was a Chanukiah, was you put it in a place that wasn't the place that you normally put your lamp. That was enough. So why can't we say the same here? Yes, we use electric lamps all the time, but we're putting this electric lamp on the kitchen table. Who puts on the kitchen table an electric lamp? Normally you put it in the dining room table or whatever. Okay, depending on what your situation is.
Sorry, can I ask you, when we stopped using olive oil for the ner tamid, and we could go to electric light.
What? Oh, you mean in here? Yeah, that I don't. That's not really like a commandment, like a mitzvah that you have to have that candle. In the synagogue, it's more symbolic. So nobody. No, yeah, it's more symbolic. But if you were the question here is, there's even an opinion that holds, for example, that wax candles are invalid for Shabbat candles. No, almost everybody uses wax candles for Shabbat candles, but there are people who use olive oil even for Shabbat candles. Because that's the olden day. That's what the Gemara always talks about olive oil being the best. It burns the best. And if you've ever lit a Hanukkah with olive oil, it does burn. It burns differently. The fire is gorgeous. It's a different clarity of light than you get from a wax candle. There's no question that it really is more beautiful. In any case, so he's saying, though, that we never had an issue with any of this stuff before. You can't just arbitrarily come along and tell me, well, it's, we really should be doing olive oil. So what, we should really be doing olive oil? So then we can't use wax candles, and we can't use that. Either you're doing the ideal or not. If not doing the ideal is okay, why are you drawing the line wherever you feel like drawing the line? That's not fair. Number one. Number two, when it comes to, if you really want to talk about, well, electricity is not good because we use electricity for everything, well, they used to use olive oil for everything and nobody ever raised an objection to that. So now all of a sudden you've decided that you can't use the same thing that you use all year round, but they never had that rule before. They just put it in a special place where it was clear that wasn't what they were using, that's all. In fact, what does the Gemara say? I'm adding on to what he says here, but the Gemara talks about why do you have a shamash on the Hanukkah? Oh, because normally you would use the candles in the kitchen or wherever for light, and you're not allowed to benefit from their Hanukkah, so you have to put a shamash so that you benefit from that instead, right? And if it's a person who normally uses candles, but if it's a person who normally uses the fireplace for light or something else, then he doesn't need to put a shamash. So that's why really nowadays you don't need to put a shamash because we use electric lights. It's a custom to do it, but it's not really necessary because nobody relies on candles for light. They always use electric lights. So really, if you have electric lights on in the room, putting a shamash is not really necessary. If you like doing it, there's nothing wrong with it. But the point is that even when the same form of light that they normally used was what they were using in the Hanukkah, nobody ever objected to it. So why are we all of a sudden objecting to it? Is the question that he's asking. And then he says, "Ve'od sharei b'Hanukkah shenaset b'miuchad lahadlakat nerot Hanukkah." And he says, moreover, this Hanukkah that you buy in the store, it's made specifically for Ner Chanukah. Lo shayach tamzeh. In those days, how did they do Nerot Chanukah? What did they do? They would take candles and just put it down there, and they would say, "This is for Chanukah." They didn't have a Chanukah that they bought at the Judaica store, or that their kids made in preschool, right? They didn't have that. All they did was take candles and put the candles and say, "This is for Chanukah." And how do we know it's for Chanukah? Because we're not allowed to use it for anything. It's only symbolic. That's how you knew. And if you used it for something, then it took away from the effect. But now we have a Hanukkah that says Hanukkah in big letters, and it's got all this thing. We know what it's for. So he says, so there's no problem of confusing it with the normal lights. Nobody uses it for normal lights. Now today we would have the other problem that if you put a single candle in a window, people will think it's one of those holiday candles that they put in the window. Anyway, so the point is that he rejects the initial objections. The initial objections that he brings are the lighter objections that he's able to dismiss and say, you know what? So far, electric Hanukkah is sounding okay. But then he says, but wait a second. Ulam ha'emet nitna lehayamer. He says, however, truthfully, you could say sheyesh tam nachon lomar she'ein yotzim yidei chovat mitzvat hadakat nerot Chanukah b'Hanukkah chashmalit. There's a very good basis for saying that you can't use an electric menorah. What's the reason? Hu mipnei she'en b'Hanukkah chashmalit lo shemen velo ptila. In other words, we saw from the Talmud that you can use any oil that you want, any fuel, and you can use any wick. But really, there's no wick or fuel in an electric Hanukkah. You don't see any fuel in there. You can open up the bulb, you don't see anything in there. Right? We know that it's just a current traveling through the conducting metal that's creating the light. We're assuming that you're using a regular bulb here, an incandescent bulb, not fluorescent bulb.
What causes is the fuel?
It's the friction. Right,
there is a fuel.
Yeah, there's a fuel, but there's no fuel in there. Okay, no, there's electricity It's energy. It's real energy, but it's not a substance that's contained in there that you can see that it's a substance. It's the traveling of the current that makes the light. It's the friction of the current in the metal that makes the light.
Work of somebody else who is generating.
That's another issue. He actually brings up that issue as well. He brings up that issue as well. So, but first of all, he says, listen, very nice to say that any oil is good, any wick is good, but there's no oil and there's no wick. There's no.
Isn't it the same problem with gas? Gas, you have a fuel but no wick.
Right. It would be the same. It would be the same problem. Yes. So a gas range would be the same issue. There's no wick. Yes. Yeah, that would be the same problem. And in the longer teshuvah, he brings that. Here, this is the shorter one that we're starting with, and then we'll go into the longer one to pick out some extra points that we're going to look at. But the conclusion is the same in both. But you're right. There's no wick in the gas one either. And now he explains why is that important. So why does there have to be a wick or a fuel? We don't see that in Hilchot Shabbat. In Nerot Shabbat, nobody ever says, well, we don't have a wick. Nobody says that. He says, Ve'anes shehitrachesh b'menorat bet HaMikdash. What's the whole reason why we're lighting this Chanukiah? To remember the miracle of the menorah on the Beit HaMikdash. Hu b'shemen. Shelo hayavo ladlik ela yom echad. V'nasa bo nes. V'dlik shmona yamim. What is the whole miracle? That there wasn't enough oil in the Chanukiah, in the menorah, to last more than a day, and it lasted 8 days. So how can you now take something that bears no resemblance whatsoever to the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash and use that? You at least has to have the tzura, the form of a wick and some kind of a fuel, so that you can remember the miracle. Otherwise, what is it? It's just a shining light. So it's a big deal that it's a shining light. How does that symbolize anything? והמצווה בהדלקת נרות חנוכה כדי להזכיר את הנס שהתרחש כבר. אבל בחנוכיה חשמלית שאין שם שמן כלל, אין בזה זכר לפרסומי הניסה. He says the problem is that you need a certain form to the mitzvah for it to evoke the memory of the miracle. And the form is that it at least has to be the tzura, the form of a menorah. The form of a candle. And what's the form of a candle? A fuel with a wick. Some kind of fuel substance with a wick. And he says, "V'chayotze bazeh katav Rabbeinu Zerachia Levi Bala Maor." This is what Rabbeinu Zerachia Levi, the Bala Maor, who's one of the great early Rishonim, one of my personal favorites because he's a very original. He was a very, very original Rishon who lived in Provence, and he was actually named my son after him because I liked him so much. He's one of my favorite Rishonim. He says, "Sha'ata'am sha'asur l'shtamesh le'oram shel nerot Chanukah." He explains what's the reason why you can't derive benefit from the light of the Hanukkah candles. You're not allowed to read by them. You're not allowed to count money by them. You're not even allowed to do a mitzvah. Nothing. What's the reason?
In the temple, they actually use the light.
For what?
For whatever, when they lit light in the temple, it was not such that...
Well, they didn't really use it because they didn't go in there. It was in the Kodesh.
Yeah, but I assume they have a menorah that they light in the temple.
Yeah, they had other lights, but the actual menorah of the Beit HaMikdash itself, nobody really used. Because it was symbolic. And he says, לפי שהם זכר לנס שנעשה במנורת בית המקדש שלא היה בשמן כדי להדליק אלא לילה אחד בלבד ונעשה בו הנס והדליק 8 לילות ולפיכך יש לאסור להשתמש בנרות חנוכה אפילו תשמיש של מצווה כמו במנורת בית המקדש. Just like benefiting from the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash, he said, hey, the Kohen says, hey, wait a second, after this I'm going to see a movie, after I'm done, so I just got to count the money in my wallet, make sure I have enough money to get in. So he takes out his wallet next to the menorah, he starts to count to make sure he has enough money. You're not allowed to do that in the Beit HaMikdash. Why? Because anything in the Beit HaMikdash, you're not allowed to derive benefit from it. It's all Kodesh. For personal benefit, you can't do. So therefore, what do we do? In other words, you might have thought, why can't I benefit from the Nerot Chanukah of the menorah? Oh, it's a very simple reason, because it's supposed to be for a mitzvah, and you shouldn't misappropriate the mitzvah. You're taking away from the fact that this Chanukiah is supposed to remind you of a concept. If you use it to check if your nails need cutting, or something like that, or if your nail polish is chipping, I don't know. But if however, what the Bala Ma'or is saying is, no, that's not the reason. It's that by not using it, you're making it more like the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash, which was only for a consecrated purpose, not for personal use. So it's not because of the mitzvah right now going on that you're not allowed to make use of it. That would be also significant, that you shouldn't take something that's a devar mitzvah and misappropriate it. He's saying it's more than that. It's that by not using the Hanukkah for your own personal benefit, you are showing that it is like the Beit HaMikdash. You're emphasizing the symbolic connection between the Hanukkah you're lighting now and the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore, what is Hakham Ovadiah bringing this to show you? He's bringing this to show you that is an indication that we need in the Hanukkah a semblance of the original miracle that we are trying to commemorate, and therefore it needs to have a wick and an oil. So you'll tell me, well, why a wick and an oil? Well, you see that we're trying to have a facsimile, so to speak, of what was going on in the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore he says, "V'chayotze bazeh katvu Rashba v'Ransham ve'im ken menorah chashmal she'en la dimyon." The menorah Beit HaMikdash, therefore an electric menorah that has no similarity whatsoever to the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash, Sharei en ba'lo shemen v'lo ptila, en yotzim ba'yidei chovat adlakat nerot Chanukah. Since we know that the essential ingredients of a ner, of a candle, are oil and wick, and it doesn't have that, it doesn't meet the basic criteria to be similar. Can you light your hair on fire and make that the Hanukkah? No. You can't just light anything. It has to be something that's going to somehow remind you of the Beit HaMikdash and remind you of the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. You can't just light random twigs and make a bonfire. That won't work either. We know that, actually. That's a halacha. That's one of the reasons why Hanukkah is not supposed to be circular. Right? It's supposed to be in a line, is because it looks like a bonfire if you make it circular. It doesn't look like, and a bonfire is not acceptable. Like, actually for Havdalah, you're supposed to have what's called an avuka, a multi-wick candle. On purpose, you're supposed to have that. But on Hanukkah, you're not allowed to have that. Why? Because it's not a normal candle, then it becomes something else. You can't light the fireplace and say, L'hadik ner shel Hanukkah. Right? It's not good. You can't. So he's saying, where do you draw the line in what's considered the form of a candle? Oil and wick. That's what you need. Oh, so it makes sense. So now he says, וכן פסק בספר פתחי שערים שלפי דברי רשב"א והר"ן הנ"ל שמדמים נרות חנוכה לנרות של בית המקדש אין יוצאים ידי חובת מצוות הדלקת נרות חנוכה בנרות הדולקים על ידי גז שאין בהם פתילה. That's what Al was saying, that also gas is no good for the same reason. It doesn't have ptila, doesn't have a wick. אינם דומים למנורת בית המקדש עד כאן תורת דתו. This is the conclusion of this sefer known as פתחי שערים. So that according to these Rishonim who say that the menorah that we light, the Hanukkah, is supposed to be a dugma, somehow an imitation of the Beit HaMikdash, the menorah Beit HaMikdash. So therefore, it needs to have a wick and it needs to have fuel. And he again says that the gas would also not count. You can't say, hey, I have an 8-burner stove. What I'm going to do is the first night I'm just going to light one, and then I light the second one. I have an electric one, so it wouldn't work for me anyway. But if a person, it's no good because there's no pitila. There's no wick. It's just a flame. Burning the gas, yes, but there is indeed a fuel, but there's no wick. So therefore, it would be no good. Again, so he says, he emphasizes this idea that just like these other sources say a gas is no good, just like a fireplace wouldn't be good, it also doesn't have petila, it doesn't have a wick. So too the electric. V'chen pasak Hagaon Rabbi Mordechai Winkler. I like these names. Mordechai. Shava pishyaltim yedei chova b'kol hashemanim. Mikol makom tzarich liot davar adome leshemen. Kegon itranu neft. Aval ner chashmal shein bo shemen klal. Yantzib yedei chovat mitzvat ner chanukah. Shezeh domeh lamadlik samim dakim. He says that lighting the ner chashmal, lighting the electric, it's not like lighting a fuel. It's more like lighting chips of wood. In other words, you end up with a flame, but there's no discernible wick and fuel there. That's what I was saying. You can't light the fireplace and say this is my ner Chanukah. It's one big ner Chanukah. It doesn't work like that. So then he says, "V'chen katav Hagaon miLublin, Rabbi Eliyahu Klatskin, the Shel Tshuvot Devar Eliyahu Shoel ve'en b'menorat chashmal lo p'tilav lo shemen, and yotzim b'yidei chovat nerot Chanukah, mishum she'anu tzrichim hadaka hadoma because it has to be a lighting which is similar to the lighting of the Beit HaMikdash, which means it has a fuel and it has a wick. Now, notice he brings a lot of sources to back up his contention here, because he realizes that there's some who might say, well, maybe I don't agree with that or whatever. So he's trying to show you that many have made this point. And then he quotes others who have made the same conclusion. And we turn to the next page, Resh Daled, Umashe Katav Sham. So here's a very interesting other possible problem that somebody might have brought up before, I can't remember. Feel free to shout out if you thought of this before, because I think somebody might have said this. He says, Umashe Katav Shem Gaon Haragechovi. That was the Rogachover. He was a very famous Gaon, right? Very famous Gaon, Rabbi Yosef Rosen. שנוסח ברכה להדליק נר של שבת או של חנוכה לא שייך בהדלקת חשמל. Very interesting. Now remember, he's living in the 19th century. Okay, he said that lighting the saying lahadlik ner shel Shabbat or lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, to kindle the Shabbat light or to kindle the Hanukkah candle, doesn't apply to electricity, because when you do electricity, you flip a switch. In other words, he's saying something different. When you push a button, that's not called madlik. So what is he saying? He's attacking it from a different standpoint. He's saying it's not because of what we would say in halachic terminology, in yeshivish terminology, they call it the chefza. They say the entity, right? It's not because of the entity that the menorah chashmalit, the Chanukiah is not a Chanukiah because it doesn't have a wick and doesn't have oil. There's something more basic. It's not the action, the maisa, they would say, right? The action. It's not an action of hadlaka. What is it? It's just pushing a button. Where's the hadlaka?
It's a substitute.
It's a something else. It leads to lighting, but it doesn't look like a lighting. So, in other words, he's saying, what's the problem here? Not just that the entity is not a proper menorah or a proper Chanukiah, but that the performance doesn't meet standards. It's not a hadlaka. What kind of a lighting is it? That's what the Rogachover said. So he says, "V'chein katav hagaon Rabbi Eliyahu Klatskin." So others bring this as well. He says, "Ulam ein ze mukhrach." So he says, but I don't necessarily think that that's obvious, because there are some who say the opposite, that say that you could say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat or shel Chanukah ner chashmal. They say that doesn't matter. The way that the light comes about doesn't matter. Okay, we do say that in other words, there's two different issues here. Issue number one is this performance and a performance of hadlaka? Another issue is this entity a ner or not? Is it a candle or not? So he says you can separate these two issues. And in fact, many say that you could light the candles and say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat and light the electric candles. There are many who say that you could do that. So he says, so that itself is not a problem. V'nir'ah she'im en lo nerot Chanukah ksherim l'hadlaka ela menorat chashmal bilvad. Yadlikenu b'lo bracha v'im nizdamin lo achar kach ner Chanukah kasher l'hadlaka yadlikenu b'bracha. He says, so my conclusion is like this. We can't say for absolute certain that lighting the electric menorah is not valid. He says what we could say is that there's two objections raised to it that are compelling. The more compelling one is that it lacks the form of a candle. The less compelling one is that the way you light it is not the normal way to light. The form of the performance is not correct. He says, but in either case, it's still possible to argue, as some poskim do, that you could say that neither of these two issues matter. And so therefore, if you don't have anything else available to you, use the electric menorah, just don't say a bracha. That's what he says. Now then he goes on to say, La'ora amur, in light of what's said above, no pun intended, נראה שאם מדליקים בבית הכנסת חנוכיה חשמלית, אין לברך עליה. So if you have a Hanukkah Hashmalit, as we have here in the front, you don't say a bracha on that. Because according to all these rabbis who say that the lighting of the electric Hanukkah is not valid, you're saying a blessing which is a blessing in vain. And he says, so he brings a very interesting thing. Why do we have this whole idea of the lighting in the Beit Knesset? So it's very interesting historically. He brings from a tshuva of the Rivash, who was one of the late Rishonim. Says that basically it's like, where did this concept? It's not mentioned in the Talmud to light the Hanukkah and the Beit Knesset. Where did it come from? It came from the fact that it used to be that the lighting of the Hanukkah was a public action because people lit the Hanukkah outside their front door. So when you would walk down the street, everybody's door, you would see the Hanukkah like they have in Israel now. You would see it. But what happened was, because of sakana, because of the anti-Semitism and all that, they brought it inside. They stopped doing it outside. So there was no more public lighting of a Hanukkah, because everyone did it in their dining room table, or they did it in their kitchen, or they did it in privacy. Now, I'm saying that, but the point is there was a certain point in history, now we're not afraid of it. Right, they'll come kill you. So nowadays, even if we started lighting it outside, maybe your homeowners association will say you're going to start a fire and we're going to send you a nasty letter or something like that. But that doesn't mean that it's not anti-Semitic. They just don't want you to burn the neighborhood down. Or putting it in the window. Many people put it in the window, and nobody. Thank God, Thank God we live in a country. If we lived in Saudi Arabia or some other less friendly country, we might. Of course, we're not allowed to live there, but if we lived in a country where Jews were less.
Israel, if you're on the Temple Mount, you can't light candles.
Right. Well, you can't even pray there. Don't say any prayers; they'll get arrested. Yeah. But the point is that if you, nowadays we're very fortunate that in most countries in the world, at least civilized ones where we would want to live, we don't have to worry about that. But there were definitely times in history where there was a great worry, and hopefully we won't see that happen again. And at those times, the idea of a public lighting of the menorah was lost. So what did they do? They reconstituted it by saying, we're going to do it in the Beit Knesset. This is what the Rivash says. It's a fascinating reason. In other words, it's not simply because what most people think, we have our private home and we have our public home, or the mitzvah, whatever they think. There's a historical reason behind it. Then now you have it. So ulam gamad. So what might you think? You might have said to yourself, well, since the whole purpose is just to publicize, and it's not really a mitzvah of Nerot Chanukah, it's just an extra thing. You don't fulfill the mitzvah if you see it in the synagogue. It has to be at home. So maybe you'll think that it doesn't have to meet the requirements or the criteria of a normal lighting. So therefore he says, skip the part. He says that even though no individual actually fulfills the mitzvah by the lighting in the synagogue, still the lighting in the synagogue has to be conducted in the same form and in a way that, were it to be an individual's lighting, it would fulfill the mitzvah. You can't just say, well, I'm going to use sparklers from the 4th of July instead, or something like that. It still has to meet the requirements. And after all, we do say a bracha, and we go to that orchot chaim shemadikim the Hanukkah Beit Knesset lo tziyei chovat et mi sheino baki ve'no zeriz mitzvah. Especially according to some opinions that say that the reason why we light it in the Beit Knesset is for those people who are not able to do it. So definitely it has to meet the requirements. Im ken bevadai shoel ladik nerot Hanukkah Beit Knesset be'ofen shecholim latzet b'hem yidei chovat mitzvah. So ve'im bechol zot rotzim ladlik Chanukah chashmalit bebeit knesset. So then he says in the part that I underlined, if after lighting a proper Chanukiah they want to light some kind of electric menorah also, ome al legag beit knesset kadesh ter el merachok v'semanes bioter, they want to put a big like a lot of the synagogues have a big one out front, like we have in our window, or some people will put it. Now that is an electric one, but the real one that we light is in there. When we have a minyan, we light it in there. So he says. So he says then what you should do in that case is first say the bracha and do the correct lighting, and then you can light whatever electric Hanukkah you want. Then it's no problem. Okay? So it's not a sin. It just doesn't give you the mitzvah. Now he says besikum. Let me conclude. Summarize. Sikum means, lisakem means to summarize. So he says En yotzim yedei chovat mitzvat hadlakat nerot Chanukah al yedei hadlakat Chanukiah hashmalit. That's the conclusion. One does not fulfill the mitzvah through lighting of a Chanukiah hashmalit, an electric menorah. Ve'im en lo ner Chanukah acher ele menorat chashmal bilvad. If all you have is an electric menorah, Yadlikena below bracha. You shouldn't say the blessing, but you should light it because that's what you have. If afterwards you're fortunate enough to come upon candles that do meet the requirements, yadlikena bivracha. So why does he have to mention that you light it with a bracha? Why does he have to mention that? In other words, he said, let's say you're in a hotel somewhere and you don't have or you're in the middle of Tanzania. I don't know. Anywhere. I'm just making up a random place. And so you lit. You all you have is an electric Hanukkah. You don't have a real one. So you light the electric one. He says without a bracha. Then it happens to be that the local witch doctor says, "Here, I have some candles for you." And so now you have candles. So he says you should light it with a bracha. Why does he have to mention that? Why doesn't he just say light it? Why does it with a bracha?
Because it's a real way of doing it.
Right, so the point is, you might have thought, well, since I already lit the electric Hanukkah, I know that doesn't definitely count, but maybe it counts. And then maybe I did the mitzvah, and now I'm going to take these candles, and when I say the bracha, I'm saying a bracha levatala. Because really, maybe the electric worked. Like Rav Yosef Mesas. Rav Yosef Mesas would say that I already did the mitzvah when I lit the original ones, when I lit the electric ones. Rav Yosef Mesas would say that I did the mitzvah, and now I'm taking regular candles and lighting them, and I'm going to say a bracha on those. How can I say another bracha? I already did the mitzvah the first time. So therefore he has to say, no, the first one really doesn't count. I'm letting you do that, because it's better to do 1/10 of a mitzvah than 0. But I'm not saying that it really counts. It definitely doesn't count. And so then he goes and he says the same thing. So he says with regard to the Beit Knesset, you shouldn't say a blessing on the electric Chanukiah. V'chein haroeh Chanukiah chashmalit toleket me'al gag Beit Knesset b'meromei keret en lo levarech al re'iyato af al b'she'en lo lahadlik ner Chanukah v'gam en madikin alav b'toch beito sh'ol v'en yotzim be'o yidecho hadlakat nerot chashmal en levarech al re'iyah shelahem. So this is another halachic concept here, which is that there is a halacha that if a person doesn't have any opportunity to light Chanukiah at home, and let's say he's traveling, he's staying on the street, he doesn't have a place where he can light a Chanukiah, and there's nobody at his house to light a Chanukiah for him either. So if he sees Nerot Chanukiah burning, he says the blessing Shas HaNisim. He can't say lahadlik because he couldn't do the mitzvah. So what happens if this guy is wandering around in the middle of Jewish nowhere? He has no place. He's going to be sleeping on the street tonight in the park. He doesn't have a place to light. He doesn't have a wife at home lighting for him or family lighting for him. He walks by the Reform Temple. They have a nice Chanukiah, electric one outside. So what does he do? So he'll say, well, if he walked by a Jew's house that had a regular Chanukiah made of regular candles, he would say the blessing Shas HaNisim, but he walks by the Reform Temple. Right? So can he say the blessing Shas HaNisim? So he says no, because since it doesn't count as a Chanukiah for lighting, it also doesn't count as a Chanukiah for seeing it. Okay, that's the point that he makes. Now, in the other tshuva, I just want to take one or two highlights from it. So he brings mostly the same ideas, and I underlined most of them. One of the ideas he emphasizes a little bit more is the difference between the Shabbat candles and the Chanukiah. That Shabbat candles, like I said, are really for providing light. They're functional candles. Chanukiah is symbolic candles. Since the functionality of the Shabbat candles is not impaired by them being electric, in fact, it could be even better, therefore there's more room to say that one could light Shabbat candles using electric lights. Whereas the Chanukiah, as we said, it's more about the symbolic evocation of the menorah that you want to accomplish through using the Chanukiah. It's symbolic, right?
It takes you back.
Right, so therefore, since it's the symbolic value, you need the form to be intact in order to accomplish the goal. He also brings here the Maharal, who says that wax candles are not good for Shabbat candles, which nobody follows that. Most people don't follow that today. And then he goes again into the issue of whether flipping a switch can be considered lighting. Okay, but he goes into more detail with it. And then he goes into a question about, is there really a requirement to have fuel? right? Because we talked about that as one of the questions. Is it enough? What if you could have light without a fuel? Would that be good enough? And he says, well, it's not exactly clear, but it could be that you do need fuel. So basically a lot of the things that he takes for granted, or that he very simply reaches a conclusion on in this tshuva, the shorter tshuva, in the lengthier one, he brings more possibilities. Well, it could be that really you don't exactly need oil. If you were able to keep the light going without oil, maybe it would be good. It's not so clear. But in the conclusion, it remains the same. And then he brings up another interesting point here, which is that we have a halacha that when you light Nerot Chanukah, he doesn't bring this in the shorter teshuvah, there's a halacha that when you light Nerot Chanukah, you have to have the amount of oil that you're going to need to burn the entire half hour. He says, in electricity, you don't have that. Because where's the fuel? Okay, it's somewhere in at Pepco they have it, but right here in my Chanukiah, if I flip the switch off, it's gone. So there's no substance of fuel there. In fact, he says some say that there's no fuel at all. Why? Because every second it's a new current. It's not the same thing that you had before. So really, there's no substance there at all. Now, if you were to take a tiny drop of olive oil and put it in a cup, you can't say lahadik ner shel Chanukah or lahadik ner Chanukah, as we say. You can't say it because you don't have enough. You don't have enough fuel to start with. You have to start with fuel. So what are you going to tell me that there's no substance of fuel in front of you? Anybody cuts that power line, and you have zero. In an instant. So he says that's another issue that we have to deal with, from the standpoint of whether there's really considered to be a substance here. And he does go into the issue about whether lighting an electric light. So again, Rav Masas is clear in saying that not only do I think that you can use electric menorah, but I say that if Moshe Rabbeinu had electricity, that's what they would have had in the Beit HaMikdash because it's much better. Okay, he doesn't say that, but he does say that even though there are questions about whether flipping a switch is considered a hadlaka, everybody agrees that flipping switch on an incandescent bulb on Shabbat is not allowed. Right? So he says, don't make a mistake and think I'm telling you that you can do that. I'm not saying you can do that. All right? At the end of the story, he ends up concluding the same as we said before, but he does in his lengthier tshuvot, which are written more for scholars. He gives you more nuance. He goes into each one of these issues, showing you the arguments on both sides in more detail. Whereas in the shorter tshuva, he just gives you, this is the bottom line. And so he does say an interesting thing. He says, "Hamuram mikol amor shedat rabim v'chen shlemim me'achronei dorenu she'en yotzim yedei chovat ner Chanukah b'dakat nerot chashmal." He's much more cautious about his conclusion in the longer Teshuvan Yabia Omer. He says that many great Chachamim say you can't use the electric menorah, and v'yesh panim hanirim ba'alacha ledivrehem, and there are bases in halacha for their view, which is much more cautious than saying absolutely it's no good. He's saying there's a good argument for what they have to say, v'lo yehei ela safek, and therefore it's a doubt. You see that? So if you were just to have read the first teshuvah that we saw, Yechaveh Da'at, the shorter one, you'd say, oh, he's saying it's no good, it's zero. Here he says, there are very strong arguments that you can't use an electric menorah, that we saw some of them. But in this longer teshuvah, he goes into, well, no, you could argue back on it, you could refute it. He gives you much more of the pilpul, much more of the back and forth. So he says, you know what, so then he says, we don't want to get into a safek. Why would we want to enter into a doubt when we can have a definite? And so listen to this very interesting ending that he gives. He says, it's well known what the Ran says, quoted in the Rivash, he says, even in regular mundane issues, a person will choose the sure path. They're not going to take the doubtful path. They're going to take the most reliable path. Even if the possibility in path A is a 99% success and path B is 100%, they'll take the 100%. They're not going to take the 99% if they have a choice. He says, certainly here, when it comes to mitzvot, spiritual things, of course, we should be even more particular about that. He says, why should we enter into a situation of doubt that we're not sure about the validity of an electric menorah? when we can go with the established path that we know is good? Why should we risk it? And he says, therefore it seems to me that if the person doesn't have any oil or any candles, and all he has is nirot chashmal, he should do it without a bracha, because it's doubtful. And he should put it in a place where it's not the normal place that he puts lights the rest of the year. So notice how much more measured and nuanced he is in a longer tshuva. He doesn't come out and say it's absolutely nothing and don't even bother, and there's only one or two people who say it's good. Here he says, you know what? The reason I'm telling you not to use it, there are arguments on both sides. You can refute some of the arguments on both sides. You can strengthen the arguments on both sides. But you know what? Since we have a definite path that we know is good, why enter into the doubt? Why risk it? Go with the sure path. And if you only have an electric menorah, since I'm not sure, don't say a bracha. He doesn't say it's definitely no good. Whereas if you read Yechaveh Da'at, you would have come away saying it's definitely no good. And if you find other candles afterwards, you should say a bracha on them. So definitely no good. Here he's saying, you know what? Since it's not clear, avoid it. But it's fascinating how he goes through, and notice, he doesn't, this tshuva, that's what I said, the tshuvot that we're going to see about the use of electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov, which is a much more complicated one, where he goes more into the scientific side of it, that's more interesting from a standpoint of electricity. Because in this tshuva, his real issue is what is the definition of a candle? Right, that's really what he's getting to here. What is the definition of a candle? Does it require a fuel? Does it require a wick? Does it require being similar to what was in the Bet HaMikdash, or is it enough that it produces light? So all of these things are really really what he's dealing with here. He's assuming there's no wick and there's no fuel. How do you deal with something that produces light with no wick and no fuel? But he doesn't get into the mechanics of how do we define electricity in halakha with respect to other things. So that's what hopefully we'll get to in upcoming installments of this series.